All right, welcome once again. Coming to you live from the Kennedy Space Center, sort of. I'm your host today, Joshua Santora, typically for NASA Communication at the Kennedy Space Center. So happy to have you all with me today. Obviously, wanting to talk about this spaceport, the John F. Kennedy Spaceport. Looking at the features here today, our main feature is the Launch Services Program. I do want to give a quick kind of note for you all. Be sure to ask questions live online in the chat box there, and tell us what things you'd like to see on future shows, and be sure to subscribe to the channel. And now, without further ado, back by popular demand, two gentlemen who need no introduction and yet demand one anyway. We have today Mr. Tim Dunn. Tim, thanks for being here.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks, Josh, for having us. That was a great introduction. Yeah, we love joining your show whenever we can.
And that is Mr. Mick Woltman there, coming to you live. Appreciate you guys, as always, joining me. So today, I want to circle back to, we had you on a couple weeks ago talking about rockets and kind of the fleet that the Launch Services Program uses. Launch Services, obviously a huge part of our spaceport here, managing a ton of launches for the world, and want to just kind of turn it back over to you guys and say, tell us more. I know today we're talking about orbits, which is a really fun kind of technical thing, but very intriguing. There are no roadways in space, so how do we do orbits? How do orbits happen? How do we actually navigate in three-dimensional space where you're not touching the ground?
Well, hopefully we're going to get into some of that. We're going to try to keep it really basic for everybody. But before we do, man, we're just excited to be back here with you, Josh. And Tim and I are excited about our jobs, as we told you guys last time. And Josh, if you'll show that picture of what we get to do every day, right? I mean, it's excitement here at Kennedy Space Center, launching rockets for as much as we can, working with our commercial partners, and looking to the future of men and women in space coming up here at the end of the month. We just love what we do each and every day. But quick recap before I let Tim get in here on orbital mechanics is last time we were with you, yeah, Tim's chomping at the bit for orbital stuff, but last time we were with you guys, we talked launch vehicles and commonality of launch vehicles, right, and our commercial launch vehicles. And you can see there kind of the commercial set that's out there today of new and retired vehicles that we've worked with in the past. Some of our great partners at United Launch Alliance, Northrop Grumman, SpaceX. We're starting to work with our folks at Blue Origin, Virgin Galactic, Rocket Labs, our old partners from Lockheed Martin and Martin Marietta, who've merged into new companies with all kinds of new commercial launch vehicles. So just to recap, that's our commercial launch vehicles there. But you know, why do we need rockets, right? Let's just talk about that really quick before we get into orbits. Why rockets? Well, we as humans have a natural curiosity to see the things we want. We got to escape Mother Earth in order to get out there and study it. So it's all about the velocity. It is all about velocity, and rockets are just plain cool. That's why Tim and I love what we do each day. Rockets are just cool. But Tim, none of this could be done if it wasn't for an amazing gentleman that you like to talk about a lot.
Bring him on, Joshua. Let's see, my favorite guy. This is the guy that started it all for us rocket guys, Sir Isaac Newton. So you see a beautiful picture there. That's about 350 years ago. And it was right when the Great Plague was hitting London. And so guess what? We're in the middle of a plague ourselves, a pandemic. And what they did in England in those days was they closed down the university. He was just about to get his bachelor's degree, and they closed the university for 2 years. Gosh, what would most of us mortals do? We would say, hey, spring break, let's go. We're out of school.
Spring break time. Let's get out. Let's go.
But not this guy. You know what Sir Isaac did? He went and he did a bunch of original research. He studied gravity, gravitation. He studied optics, and he laid in the basics of calculus as we know it today. So what are you guys doing during a pandemic as you are teleworking from home? Mick, have you done anything like that yet?
I have done some research, Tim. I've been studying up on my clock making skills lately, and you know, that's a lot tougher than it looks for an engineer, but it's been fun. I've taken this opportunity to learn a few new things outside of my normal day job. It's been really cool. I think that's cool that Sir Isaac Newton did that work and moved forward for us and got us those, you know, 3 laws that we like to talk about, right?
That's most right. And the third law is the one we love, right? For
That's
every
absolutely.
action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. So we got our rockets that we love so dearly. And so when we light the fuse on this end of the rocket and we start blowing out the fire and the smoke, we get that equal and opposite reaction of going to space.
That's
So
right.
let's go to the next slide, Joshua, and let's talk a little bit about basic orbital mechanics. Surprise me. What slide are you going to bring to me? Hey, there we go. So let's talk about what does it mean to be in orbit? Well, let's put us a cannon on the North Pole and let's start firing out cannonballs. Let's just we have a standard velocity muzzle and fire a few cannonballs. What's it going to do? It's going to splash down. And there we go. It's going to splash into the ocean, right? But guess what, Mick? We got some great friends in the space business, don't we?
We do. And you know what? As I said earlier, Tim, it's all about the velocity, man. It's all about the velocity.
So guess what? We are going to dial up Jeff Bezos on Amazon, and we're going to say, hey, Jeff, we got you at Amazon. We got Elon Musk on the other line. He wants to fund our Cannon 2.0 with a muzzle velocity of...
Hey, don't forget our good friend Tori Bruno over at ULA.
Tori's
going to want in on that too,
He's going to get the ballistics just right on that muzzle for me. And these three guys working in concert with you and I, we're going to get that muzzle velocity up to, let's pick a number, Mick, 17,800 miles per hour.
That sounds like a good number, Tim.
And let's start firing that cannon off the North Pole. And we're going to bring that cannon up to, pick a number, 115, 120 miles above the surface of the Earth. And guess what? That cannonball, it wants to fall into the ocean, but it's got too much what, Mick?
Velocity, Tim. Too much velocity.
Too much energy and velocity. It can't. So it continues to fall around the Earth. And that's how we have satellites in orbit. So let's talk a little bit about where we launch these guys from. Where does it all start?
Yeah, that's exciting for us. We talk launch vehicles. We love our launch vehicles, but we also love our launch sites. So, we launch from many different places around the globe, but two particular right here, Tim. And why don't you start off and tell us a little bit about the Eastern Range?
Yeah, there you see a beautiful shot of our country, both what we call launch ranges, one on the East Coast, one on the West Coast. I want to talk a little bit about why do we launch from Florida? Well, back in the early days of rocketry, rockets weren't quite as safe as they are now. We needed lots of big blue ocean to launch out into, right? So was undeveloped country here in Brevard County all along the East Coast here. So we started launching those test rockets way back in the late 40s, early 50s. And so that's how we established the Eastern Range. And from the Eastern Range, we can generally launch a little bit north through a little bit south of due east. Kind of has the fan chart shows here. So guess what? I got my handy dandy globe here. Here's the United States. And guess what, Mick? Every day since you've been born, what has the sun done? It has risen in the
east,
and it has set in the
west.
Thus, the Earth is rotating, right?
Rotating.
And so, if we're right here on the coast of Florida and we launch due east, we get to take advantage of that natural velocity that the Earth is already providing, about 1,000 miles per hour of rotational velocity of the Earth.
That is free energy that we get right there to help
Absolutely
our rockets
free
going.
energy. So from the East Coast, we're going to go into some low Earth orbits, some equatorial low Earth orbits, and a special orbit I'm going to tell you guys about in just a little bit called a geosynchronous orbit. So Mick, why don't you tell us about the other side of our country?
Yeah, so one of our other favorite ranges is the Western Range out in California, or Vandenberg Air Force Base. You talked about Kennedy Space Center and Cape Canaveral Air Force Station here on Florida, but Vandenberg Air Force Base out in California is one of our favorite launch sites also. And what's unique about that, Tim, same as you said, is we need that big blue ocean, right? We want to, personnel safety is number one. We want to make sure everybody's safe when we launch these things. So as you can see from the fan of Vandenberg, we head due south from there. And there's some degrees in that due south area from where we launch. But what's cool about that is we get into a really cool orbit that is called a polar orbit. And if you show your globe there, Tim, Yep.
Oh,
What
yeah.
that means is we leave California, we head down towards the South Pole, we come back around to the North Pole, and we keep going around. And then to take advantage of what you were saying, the Earth is spinning. So what happens is every 14 days, we can see the same spot on the Earth as the satellite travels around there. So what's really cool about that is if people are out there with Google Earth or Landsat, the Landsat satellite or Digital Globe that get these cool pictures that we see of Earth, that's how we get them, is in that special polar orbit that we get out of California.
Hey,
I see
Mick,
Josh might have a question
yeah,
there.
I wanted to ask. So I heard something mentioned recently about polar orbits and the eastern range, and I heard a rumor that there's discussion of that. And this is something I've obviously been working at the agency for a while. I've seen a lot of launches, and I've always been told you can't fly polar from the eastern range. So do you guys have some more information on that?
I'll take that one, Joshua.
Yeah,
So,
go ahead, Tim.
as a matter of fact, in the very early days of rocketry, in the late 50s and early 60s, as in 1960, we did launch polar from the eastern range. But guess what? When we do that, we have to overfly our friends to the South Cuba, and then we have to fly down through the Panama Canal area and overfly Central America. So there was a little incident maybe back in 1960 where we might have dropped parts of a rocket on our friends to the south there in Cuba. So the State Department said, probably not a smart thing to do anymore. Let's not do that. Let's go out to California and launch polar. But our good friends at SpaceX have reattacked that situation with our new capabilities in their incredible Falcon 9 rocket that has autonomous flight termination system on it. And they're able to land first stages downrange or fly them back to the launch site. And because of that, they have represented that option to fly polar out of the eastern range. And if all goes well, we may see that actually demonstrated on a commercial mission coming up this summer from the Cape.
Yeah, and again, Tim, as you said, autonomous flight termination, that's all about safety. And as you said, going over the land and stuff. So we just want to make sure that's, so yeah, SpaceX has presented that case again, Josh, and we'll see how that plays out.
Do you guys anticipate that that's something that will become common beyond just like polar from Florida? Because that kind of raises the question, does the technology evolution allow us to fly more places safely?
I think so. Yeah, go ahead,
With
Tim.
the advent of the autonomous flight termination system, you get much quicker response and much more safe flight of the vehicle. And that is the direction that all of the rockets and the technology is going, is to bring those smart systems onto the rocket. So the more smart systems you get on, the smarter the rockets are, the easier they are to fly and from more locations. So we look forward to that added capability on the East Coast. But we're certainly going to be utilizing the West Coast for its tremendous advantage that it offers for the rest of the fleets.
Yeah, and besides,
and again, Josh, it gets back to safety. The companies are making these leaps and bounds in technology, but they're always continuing to look at safety as their number one thing, to not only protect the society and where we are, but also, as we mentioned in our last video with you, or last conference with you, our payload customer, right? We want to make sure mission success and make sure everything is safe and we get our spacecraft customer where they need to be. So the other cool thing about working in the Western range, as we said, polar orbit there, one of the other ranges that we have on the west, or a little farther west, I guess, Tim, right? Depending on which way you're going, is one that I have personally been able to go to, and that's the Kwajalein Island in the Marshallese, or Kwajalein Atoll in the Marshallese Islands down there. It's out there in the middle of the South Pacific, and what's really cool about Kwaj Island is we can take a small launch vehicle, like our Pegasus launch vehicle that's mounted on the bottom of an L-1011 that we talked about last time, and we can get it out to Kwaj Island, and we can use it to launch a payload into an equatorial orbit. And the cool thing about that is Kwaj is only a few degrees above the equator, as you see the red line there heading off towards the equator. What that allows us to do is use that smaller launch vehicle to lift heavier mass of payload and getting it into that equatorial orbit for science. So really cool opportunity there. to visit the island and get out there for some spacecraft stuff, it's definitely a unique launch site that we've been able to participate in our career here with Launch Services Program.
Yeah, Mick, we've talked a little bit about these orbits, low Earth orbit, polar orbit, geosynchronous. Let's show a chart there, Joshua, and let's talk a little more. All right, so coming out of that eastern range here in Florida, you see that pink ribbon on the chart here. That shows a rocket leaving the Cape in low Earth orbit. And by low Earth orbit, we generally mean about 150 to 300 miles above the surface of the Earth. And so that's where our space station operates. That's where a lot of our Earth science satellites operate. And so if we want to also utilize the eastern range, we can go into an incredibly special orbit. And if you follow that pink ribbon around twice around the Earth, and then it turns into a blue ribbon, it takes you all the way out to geostationary orbit. Geo meaning Earth, stationary meaning still. Wait, what does still mean in space? Well, if you take my handy dandy tiny little pink satellite here and my Earth, we know that the Earth is roughly about 8,000 miles in diameter. If I take my satellite about 22,000 miles above the surface of the Earth, about 3 Earth diameters, I get into a geostationary orbit where the satellite orbital velocity in its period around the Earth matches the Earth's period of rotation and its orbital velocity. So relative to a position on Earth, it never changes. And that's the beauty of all of our communication satellites.
I was going to ask you, what is that good for?
Dish Network, DirecTV, all of these wonderful communication things, or our weather satellites that are out at geostationary that need to keep the same view of weather over Florida, so Mick and I know when to prepare for hurricanes.
Hey, that's right. Yeah, that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mick, tell us about some orbits that we go into from the West Coast and what they're used
so
for.
we talked about the polar orbit. If we go back to the chart, back one chart there, Josh, we see where Tim talked about the pink ribbon coming out of the Cape. Well, if you look at the blue ribbon that goes over the North and South Pole, that is the polar orbit that we talked about that we launch out of Vandenberg. And you basically get to cover the poles, top and bottom of the Earth. And as Earth spins around, we can then take pictures of every square mile of the Earth. Every 14 days, we get the same picture. Now, that can be useful in a lot of things, and we won't go into that today. But the biggest thing is Google Earth or pictures you want to take. If you've looked up your house, right, you can see how the picture changes every 14 days if it's put up that way. So that's a really cool orbit to leave out of Vandenberg. But, you know, Tim, we talked about some special things that have happened to us over a career. And I think you and I both agree that one of the coolest things that's happened out of the West Coast is getting into a Mars trajectory orbit with a certain mission. And, you know, let's see the next chart on an interplanetary orbit, what that looks like. Talk us through that, and I'm going to come back to the mission I'm referring to.
Yeah, so here's a Mars interplanetary orbit. So a lot of times we don't just want to stay in the vicinity of the Earth. We want to go exploring into our solar system and beyond. And so this is a representative picture showing the Earth and Mars and how we would leave the Earth, staying roughly in the ecliptic plane of our solar system, and then intersect Mars. Takes us about 6 months of transit time to get to Mars. And so generally for interplanetary flight, our nation has always launched out of the Eastern Range. And we were going to take advantage of that performance that I mentioned, getting the Earth's velocity, getting a little bit of added boost, heading out on an equatorial departure from the Earth on our way to Mars. But we have had occasion in the past, one time in particular, a couple of years ago. Mick, tell us about what happened that was special out of Vandenberg.
Yeah, that was cool, right? The InSight mission, Mars mission. First time in my career that we've launched a Mars mission. I think first time in your career too, that we've launched a Mars mission out of Vandenberg. And what was really cool about that, as you said, Tim, leaving out of the East Coast, we get that extra 1,000-mile-an-hour energy boost with the Earth, right? Well, if you're in Vandenberg and you launch to the west, you're fighting that 1,000-mile, right? So how can you launch a Mars mission to Mars from Vandenberg? Well, nice thing about that is our friends at United Launch Alliance that launched that mission for us, we had so much extra performance in the Atlas V rocket that launched InSight that we were able to launch InSight from Vandenberg and compensate for that 1,000 miles an hour with the extra performance that we had in the vehicle. So that was an exciting time, not only for us at NASA, but everybody in the aerospace industry, to be able to see that happen with the extra performance and getting a Mars mission out of Vandenberg. It was a sight to see.
Hey guys, we had a couple of social questions coming through the chat window. I wanted to ask you. The first was, tell us more about kind of the nature of being at the equator and getting that energy boost. Do you have to be dead on the equator to maximize that boost? Is it like a sliding scale? Is it anywhere gets the same kind of boost?
So if you're on the equator at 0 degrees north latitude, 0 degrees south latitude, you get the maximum boost, and it's a little bit greater than 1,000 miles per hour of rotational velocity that you get. As you go north, if you went all the way to the North Pole, you get 0 boost. So where we're at in Florida at 28 degrees north latitude, we're getting roughly about 900 and some odd miles per hour of boost. And the farther you go north, it decreases that boost. So from 28 degrees north latitude, where we're at in Florida here at the Cape, we do see about 900 miles per hour of free velocity.
That's awesome.
And as I stated earlier, Joshua, launching from Kwajalein, we're only a couple of degrees above the equator, so we can use that smaller launch vehicle to get more mass into orbit because we get that extra boost heading to the 0 degree on the equator, right? So that small, we don't have to have a really big rocket to lift the same amount of weight to get us where we need to be going. So that works out to our advantage, being able to do that.
Cool. One more question that came through was, I know we mentioned with the polar orbits, we specified southern flights with polar orbits. Can we fly north for polar orbits, and does it work the same way?
Go ahead, Tim.
Oh, so we can fly north from the Cape. We can go up to about 52 degrees north of the equator on azimuth. So not quite due north like we can at Vandenberg. We can go due south. So, but what you really need to know is you don't have to go due north, because once you get into orbit, you're going north, south, south, north as the Earth is moving under you. So even if you were to start flying north out of Vandenberg, which you wouldn't necessarily want to do because you kind of tend to fly right along the coast of California, and I don't think the folks in San Francisco and Seattle would appreciate that as much. But you get the same effect. So we really don't have to launch to the north.
Yeah, so I actually, the reason I threw that over to Tim is I had a question for Tim because he hit on it. The 52 degrees, that is pretty close, right, coming out of Florida here. But today, what do we use that for, right? Another launch site we forgot to mention is Wallops Island, where we launched some cargo supply out of. But between Wallops and Florida, why do we launch that 52 degrees? Where are we headed? What are we doing?
So anytime we're going to out of the Cape on a resupply mission to our favorite space station, the International Space Station, we're heading out at about 51 and a half degrees inclination to the equator, so that we can match up with the ISS's orbital plane. And it's because the reason it's at that higher plane than where Florida is at 28 degrees was a compromise we had with our international partners, the Russians, who launch out of Baikonur in Kazakhstan. And they're at roughly about 46 degrees north latitude, but to avoid China, they have to launch no higher than about 52 degrees. So good question, Nick.
Yeah, that's what I was wanting to hit on, is our favorite station where we study a lot and we get to see ISS. So those are important for us to get out of Florida. So yeah. So hey, so on that, we talked launch vehicles last time, we talked orbits last time. Things are always important to what we need to do. And you know what's really important for us is to put all that together for some of the few upcoming missions we've got in LSP, Tim. And we are so excited about these missions. I'm telling you, Mars 2020, we talked about that interplanetary mission, right? We're going to launch that in July of 2020 here. We're going to be launching from Cape Canaveral Air Force Station, our eastern range, heading to an interplanetary trajectory for Mars. We are so excited that we got to see the helicopter Ingenuity mated to Perseverance recently, and they are mating all that together and getting it ready to put on the Atlas V for launch. But then we've got an ocean science spacecraft, Sentinel-6, that we're going to be studying the ocean with. And that we're looking at November 2020, but we're going to launch that one out of Vandenberg Air Force Base, right? So we can get into a polar orbit and we can see the same spots in the ocean every 14 days and do that. It's exciting. And then, Tim, you talked a little bit about geosynchronous satellites, or geostationary, sorry about that. GOES-T, you talked about our weather satellite. The next powerful weather satellite we've got to meet up with its brother and sister GOES-R and S that we launched a couple years ago for weather, launching in December of 2021. Again, launching here from Cape Canaveral Air Force Station, Eastern Range, so that we can get that continuous weather monitoring that you and I like to know when our hurricanes and tropical storms are coming. So those are 3 really important missions we've got coming up in the near future using these different launch sites and orbits that we just talked about. So you put the launch vehicle together and the orbits together, and that's what it comes down to, is launching our spacecraft customer and getting science into space. So exciting stuff coming forward there.
Yeah, awesome. Gentlemen, as always, I know that you're super busy getting ready for that Mars 2020 flight here in July. Super excited for that. Appreciate you being with us today. Tim, Mick, always a pleasure.
Hey, Josh, thanks again for having us.
Be with you, Josh. Thank you.
Yeah, I want to ask you all.
Always a pleasure being with you, Josh, and the team. So thanks for all you're doing during this to keep everybody informed of what's going on here at Kennedy.
Yeah, listen, we're having fun and trying to make sure people know that we're still making progress moving forward. Always.
Hey, we're still launching rockets. That's what it's all about. Rockets are cool.
Rockets are cool. Tune in next week to our series all week long. We're going to be talking about the Artemis program. We're calling it our Artemis Week for the Launch Services program, and Tim and Mick and all the fun that they have. We will see you next time. That's going to do it from us here. And I just want to remind you that even the sky isn't the limit.